and started.
Morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, everyone across the world. Welcome to this panel on AI-aided precision medicine, an unavoidable required revolution. We're going to be presenting this panel at the World Artificial Intelligence Conference 2021 in Shanghai. So this is Enrico Santus, and as you see from the name of this panel, there is a kind of redundancy, unavoidable and required. Why so? We will discover this with some very interesting speakers. But before getting to them, let me say two words about myself and about the reasons behind this panel. I am a data science leader at Bayer and an AI scientific advisor in the Laboratory of Data Discovery for Health at the Hong Kong University, and advisor of the Women's Brain Project and K-Tracer. And here are the speakers. Okay, before getting there, we know that the COVID-19 pandemic has made us aware of the limitations of the healthcare system, and it showed that also the most advanced healthcare systems were kind of suffering and unable to scale in the worst moment of this crisis. So precision medicine supported by AI may be the answer to this kind of problems, whether we will be facing in the future. And we're gonna speak about this with speakers of very high caliber, like Michelle Colucci. Hi, Michelle. Can you hear us?
Can. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Michelle is a founder and managing partner of Digital DX Ventures and the lawyer and the serial entrepreneur. As a venture capitalist, she is focused on impacting the health field by investing in companies that enable doctors to make better diagnostic decisions through the application of AI and big data. Next to Michelle, there is Alexandros Polis. Alex, can you hear us?
I can hear you, yes.
Hi, Alex. So Alexandros is a senior AI director at TransPerfect, and he works on the data stream. He works on collecting, annotating data that actually enable AI to work. And later we will hear more about that. And then there is Harsha Gurlingappa from Merck. Hi, Harsha, can you hear us?
Hi, Enrico. Thanks for having me in the call.
Thanks for joining. So Harsha is a head of text analytics, correct, Harsha?
You're right, yeah.
Yes, and the group responsible to drive the development and adoption of practices leveraging text analytics and natural language processing across organizational sectors. And then we have Charlotta Lindvall. Hi, Charlotta, can you hear us?
Hi, nice to be here today.
Hi, Charlotta. So Charlotta is a faculty at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, Brigham and Women's Hospital, and Harvard Medical School. And thanks for joining. She is leading an innovative cross-disciplinary lab that includes physicians, nurses, computer scientists, and so on, with the goal of developing artificial intelligence methods for language analysis within the context of cancer care. And last but not least, we have Stefano Piotto, who is a professor at the University of Salerno. Stefano, can you hear us?
Yes, hello, everybody. Hello.
Hi, welcome. So he is professor at the University of Salerno in the Department of Pharmacy, where he teaches chemistry and biomaterials. He's the director of Bionam, an department, biomaterials center, and is board in several associations in artificial intelligence and the international journals. So welcome to all of you, and I'm really happy to have you here today. And maybe we start immediately with the first topic that we may want to address. And let me turn off my presentation so everybody can see you. Okay, so there you go. And welcome. And so the first question was about what you think are the drivers of this revolution. Why does AI matter in the healthcare domain? I'll start this question with Michelle, if you like.
Yes,
Then
of
we-
course. Thank you. Yeah. Well, I think that what we're finding is the ability to digitalize everything really is what's driving. I mean, we have so many new technologies, CRISPR, NGS sequencing, long read sequencing, massive parallel, sequencing technology offering like a lot of ultra high throughput, scalability, and speed. So, and then you look at the body, you take the data, AI, and technology innovation, and then you cross that with what's going on in your body. Our bodies are really big data problems. Our genomics, our epigenomics, our microbiome, our immune system, viral, communicable proteome, they're all, have billions of data points in them. So the intersection of those two verticals, empowered and enabled by the development of AI and machine learning, I think is really why we have the situation we have today, which is quite amazing, and the ability to really solve a lot of the problems we never could before.
Thanks. Yeah. So basically, on the one end, there is the biological part and the technological part that are matching together in this particular period. Are there also other reasons? Maybe we may ask to Charlotta, who is working in the clinical setting. Are there also other reasons, maybe from demographics or some other phenomena that are changing this environment?
Yes, definitely. I agree with Michelle that just the amount of data and the technologies that are available makes it possible to process this data. I think for the human brain, for clinicians, it's just not possible to process all the information that's available, and that's where AI would be extremely helpful, just to kind of pre-process data and provide that information in a way to clinicians that just makes it easier to make medical decisions together with their patients.
Thanks. And so data is another ingredient of this incredible recipe, right? And maybe I'd say that Alexandros can tell us a little bit more about that. I mean, we know that big data has reached nowadays about 44 zettabytes of data, which is like a huge amount, and it's humanly impossible to manage it without this technology. So, Alex, can you tell us something about it?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite topics, and I could talk about it the whole day. So the challenge with processing all this data is that you also need a lot of data to train machine learning models that can make all that processing more efficient. The good news that the community started discovering in the last few years is that you may be able to start with less data. As long as that data is of high quality, is properly labeled, it's cleaned, and it's fit for purpose. So yes, there is an opportunity. Thanks to the available amounts of data, there is a challenge, and there are some solutions in place already right now that we're pursuing. But if you allow me, I would like to take a step back and answer also the previous question, and just add to what my colleagues here said. So there are a few more societal challenges that we need to address, and we need to address them really urgently, right? So one of them is the aging population, obviously, the demographic problem that we're facing. It means that we need more care for patients. We need more care for the elderly, even if they're not patients. And that's something we cannot necessarily achieve with traditional medicine. And that's something that AI is helping because it's obviously providing or it's promising that there will be faster drug discovery, or even other areas where AI is helping, like robotics. Okay, and robotics are not so much in the traditional healthcare sense, but robots as companions. If we take a look at Japan, which is one of the first examples of what happens when you have a rapidly aging population, we'll see that they are investing heavily in getting robots as companions and carers for people gradually. The other reason is what we recently saw with the pandemic, and that was one of several similar situations, I would say, that we had in the past, where we see we cannot really afford taking so much time for drug discovery or for additional prevention and treatment measures. So AI and data are going to play a tremendously important role here.
Thanks. Thanks, Alex. Yes, and I'd like, there are 2 points that I'm very interested about. One is the pharmaceutical point, and then we're going to go there with Arsha and with Stefano, and then the investment part, because definitely to allow this revolution, you need to invest, right? You need to somehow resources to invest in it. So let's go first with the pharmaceutical part. So what is, from your perspective, Arsha, the biggest challenge there, and what is the driver of this revolution in the pharmaceutical domain? And then Stefano, please feel free to intervene, because you guys have you're in the same field.
So from a pharma point of view, right? So you spoke about, I think we have 2 questions here, right? One is, what are the challenges and what are the driving points somehow, right? For adaptation of AI and so on. So when it comes to the challenge perspective, I think it all depends. For example, access to the data, for instance, is definitely one of the challenges, for instance. So not every organization might be completely open to kind of data sharing practices. And there is a lot of data literacy, the kind of work that has to be done. And also within our organization, we have been strongly working on ensuring that we kind of embed this kind of a data sharing culture so that it's more easy to kind of get access to different types of data. It's more easier to integrate the data from different sources so that we are able to kind of drive more actionable and kind of valuable insights, I would say. So that is one of the challenges that I can imagine right now. And in terms of the drivers, definitely plenty of them I can imagine, right? Definitely there is a cost as one of the factors, for instance. So if you see a lot of redundant work that is being done, let's say manually, and there is a lot of interest to ensure that we are able to kind of cut down the costs, for instance. We want to expedite the whole process of the drug discovery and development processes, right? So everybody knows that the whole process of pharmaceutical product development, it can be a very time-consuming task. It can take up to 10 to 15 years to develop a pharmaceutical compound, which can then go out to the market. And if you look at the failure rate, starting from the in silico research to it's going to the market, you see like there are various phases where basically either in silico research or it could be animal testing, clinical trials, we observe that a lot of compounds kind of tend to fail eventually in the period of time, increasing the overall cost and time to the market as well. So that is also definitely one of the important factors. So that how can we now bring in the concepts of, let's say, AI, digitalization, and so on, so that we are able to even expedite the whole process of the drug discovery and development processes as well.
I see. So moving from in vitro to in silico may somehow support this change, right? Stefano, do you have anything to add to this?
I mean, Arsha said very important things. So the pharmaceutical industry is tremendously inefficient compared to other industries like automotive or computers. Because as Arsha said, I mean, it's a very long process with many failings, and artificial intelligence is now the chance to change the trend, just to increase the speed and efficiency. But of course, I mean, there are most of the techniques that we are using that are around are quite old and well established. So there are some limitations because we now have a great chance to change the trend, but there are still the problem that was already mentioned by Alexandros about the quality of the data, because we have to provide the quality of the data, and with many integration of data from different data sources, this is really a challenge. And maybe just afterwards, later on, I will say something about the role of robotics, not in terms of patient care, but how robotics could help to standardize the data and to provide high quality data, because this is the only way that we can use a machine learning to drug discovery. So there's a global change in the way the pharmaceutical industries has to evolve, because as I mean the traditional techniques in pharmaceutical industries cannot be sustained anymore. I mean, it's tremendously costly, and as Alex said before, in particular with the pandemics, then everybody realized that we cannot use the old tools with the new challenges.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have identified several important points. We've identified the technology, we identified the data, we identified investment, and this movement towards efficiency and effectiveness. There is also another word that came to my mind, and which is sustainability. Sustainability not in terms of environment, of course, but in terms of like making the system sustainable for the aging population. There was demography. I think Alex mentioned the demographic changes, right? Population is getting older and older. If I'm not wrong, in 2018, for the first time in history, the people over 65 years old were more than the people below 5 years old. So it's telling us that this process is becoming like very serious. And also, we were talking about the cost of the drugs, of drug development. If I'm not wrong, we are talking about 2 billion for every drug that actually gets to the market, right? So, and 10 years of development. Imagine if this was the perspective during the COVID-19. In this whole, I have a question. What do wearable devices, do the wearable device play a role, and what kind of role would they play? And maybe I want to start with Charlotta in this sense, because Charlotta is very experienced in the clinical domain, and I was curious because there is this IoT piece of the AI development. Do you already see these devices being used in the clinical domain?
Yes, I think it can be very useful in oncology to monitor for side effects, because even with a simple wearable device, if you get the baseline patient data and then suddenly the patient is not active at all, you know that something is going on. They may be having more side effects from the chemotherapy or other cancer treatment. And that's a time point where a clinician should call and kind of follow up and make sure the patient is fine. So even like fairly basic devices could be very helpful. And there is definitely research in integrating that type of data in the clinic, and really to understand where to maximize the timing of when the clinician is interacting with the patient, and so that that's efficient and that it makes sense, you know, so that you optimize that process.
I see. Yeah, we're gonna get back to the interaction because it's that's another crucial step of the healthcare domain. So we were talking about adverse events. I know two people here are working or have been working on adverse events, meaning Arsha utilizing natural language processing techniques, and Alexandros with annotations. Do you want to tell us a little bit more of what adverse events are and why they are so important?
So I can go first if you want.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, so from the adverse event point of view, right? So basically, what is an adverse event, right? So when the medicine is released to the market, when it's in phase 4 clinical trials, right? That is a point of time where medicine is now kind of consumed by a very large populations in the market. And you start to kind of observe some anomalies in the way the patients have been taking the medicines, right? For example, it could be overdosing. It could be kind of, let's say, as an example, alcoholism, for instance, right? Or could be concomitant medications, things like this, right? Then that is the point of time you start kind of seeing some of the behavior in the patients or in the customers that you might not have observed in your clinical trial phases. And we being it's a healthcare/pharma industry, it is very important that we are able to kind of monitor all the adverse events that has been reported by the patients. And then we are able to report it back to the health authorities so that we can stay compliant with the processes. And there are different processes that are defined. If these are more casual adverse events, kind of more known adverse events, something like nausea, vomiting, things like this, it could still be okay. So we do have significant amount of time where we can kind of process the case, and we can have some time to really submit the case back to the authorities. But if these are more serious events, for example, death of a patient or kind of abnormalities caused, it could even be a potential abnormality. Maybe you are not 100% sure it's caused by the drug, or maybe patient had an abnormality when he was taking a drug, for instance. So these are some of the very serious cases that has to be reported to the authorities in a predefined time frame, typically a couple of hours. And that is where it becomes very challenging, because how do customers interact? How do patients interact with us, right? So they interact with us either in the voice or either typically in the form of free written text, social media, right? And that is where it becomes very, very challenging, because you start observing a lot of diversity in the data now, right? You have different languages, for instances. You have data coming from the voice. You have data coming from the text. The data can be present in some standard forums. It could be social media, patient reporting forums, and all these things, right? It becomes very, very challenging. And it's not very easy for a couple of experts to kind of quickly screen and automatically capture all the adverse events and report it back to the authorities in this predefined period of time. So that is where basically the whole concept of this AI ML kind of becomes very crucial, that we are able to augment the expert efforts so that we are able to, let's say, capture all the adverse events in right time, so that we are able to process, or let's say, report back the information to the health authorities in the right time.
And
Yeah,
intervene.
that's my perspective of how important this AI ML can play in the whole space of adverse events.
Thanks.
What do you, Alex?
And I ask everyone to please intervene whenever you want. I mean, it's like, feel free to intervene anytime.
Yeah, I was thinking of what I could answer, and with every new section that Harsha was going into, I was seeing my answer already been taken. So, but I think I could still add something here. So I would like maybe to highlight something that wonderful that Harsha said, that we have all these different channels that we're getting data from. We have all these different types of data that we can leverage, like speech data or image data and so on. We can use speech recognition, voice biometrics techniques, and computer vision, for example, alongside natural language processing to analyze data from all these different sources. And the question here is, okay, are we replacing maybe humans with that? Because this kind of work, processing all this data has been offering thousands and thousands of jobs to people. And I'd like to highlight here that this actually presents an opportunity to create new types of jobs, with the data workers being in the heart of that pipeline, because we're not replacing these jobs with AI. Actually, we are reshaping them. We're changing the roles. We are retraining these resources to provide data in the right format for AI to perform as we need it to. And at the same time, AI is not necessarily taking away that work, is just helping us scale. So address more data channels, more data types at the same time. All right. And just to draw a little line and connect this topic to the previous question about wearable devices. Just imagine what is happening with consumer products, because wearable devices are not only medical devices anymore, or they can be classified as medical devices, but the ones that we can buy in a shop at any time, right? So through your watch nowadays, or other types of simple wearable devices, you can get voice data, voice biometrics. You can get motion data, right? You can know how many times a patient has fallen in their home, and maybe you can combine that with some visual information and patient input itself to combine it and draw conclusions much faster than what you would have done a few years ago, and with a little bit less ambiguity.
I would also add to Alexandros' point and take that one step further, which I think is really key here. And that is that we're finding that there are all sorts of factors that play into disease. So we're looking at, genetics, epigenetics, microbiome, epibiome, but then also we're looking at your electronic medical record, right? Your past health issues, your history. Then we're looking at environmental influences and lifestyle factors. So whether you look at diet, sleep, stress, smoking, stuff like that, or you're looking at your socioeconomic, factors, where you live, your zip code, your job. And what's really exciting about wearables and other kinds of technology is that we're able to collect all that data, and we really believe that it's giving us the whole picture. So the confluence and overlap of some of those data sets are giving us far more accurate insights into illnesses we cannot otherwise get. If you look at mental health, right, it's largely observational. Some people will say, okay, there's also a blood component, or there's a chemical component. Your microbiome also can affect. But the key is going to be to cross over with all these kinds of factors and data points to really get the most accurate, either predictive or diagnostic, results, so that you can then also, with these kinds of things, you can also target the right treatment based on the personal genetics of the person, based on all those things I mentioned. So it's a holistic way. Data enables us, and wearables and all that gives us a more holistic way of figuring out what's wrong with us and what to do about it on a very basic level.
Yeah. I would like to add, to make an example very related with what my colleagues said, and just taking the example of the clinical trials that Charlotta mentioned. For example, we exploit this approach just to support the clinical trials analysis using heart data, using the wearable devices. So just acquiring these ECG electrocardiograms, and then to provide a real-time monitoring of the most important information about that. Not just about feature detections, because the feature detection, it was a quite, let's say, easy task, but just the global analysis of the full bunch of data that can be provided by a wearable device. And this now, we are applying this to analysis to support the clinical trials. And this is really challenging because it offers a complete new way to analyze the data. Because sometimes the patients that are taking a pill and they have to provide, their feelings, their reactions. Sometimes if the dose is not high enough, they don't know exactly what to express, what to tell about the effect, but their heart knows perfectly what is going on. Yes.
Dear, I think Charlotta may have a lot to say, but Charlotta, give me 1 second to recap a little bit. So we talk about the job shift. So it's not going to be like the AI will steal jobs, but there's going to be a shift, right? People will learn new skills, will perform smarter tasks instead of the repetitive tasks that can be instead performed by AI. So that's a very great point. I'd like to go in 2 minutes to Michelle for the investment part, and which areas of the world are the most interesting from the investment point of view, because investments are actually the gasoline that move all these big machines, right? The needs is one, and the investment are the other. But before then, yes, let's go to Charlotta. So Charlotta, we heard somebody speaking about EHR. And we heard somebody also speaking about the fact that patients sometimes don't know how to report their symptoms or their feelings and so on. I know you've been working quite a lot in this domain. So can you tell us a little bit about it?
Thank you. So I think symptoms is a really good example where we really need to triangulate different types of data, because the patients too, as Stefana said, they are asked to say, do you have nausea? Do you have pain? Do you have this symptom right now? But maybe when the patient is filling out that survey, they don't have the symptoms, but 3 hours later, they actually do have the symptom. So using variable devices, prompting the patient when you see a change in the variable device, like you mentioned, like the heart rate is changing, actually prompting the patient at the right time to fill out that survey question where they actually have to fill out whether or not they have some symptom. And then also linking that with what's already in the EHR. I mean, every time a patient sees a clinician, the clinician has to write a clinical note. And so that data is absolutely enormous. cancer patients often accrue hundreds of notes within half a year. And so with Enrico, we have been mining, we use natural language processing to capture symptoms from the EHR. And I think just putting as little burden as possible on the patient and getting most of the data through these natural language processing through the wearable devices, and then trying to really, you know, the patients, we only have so much of their attention, and they're sick too, they're going through illness. So really targeting the right time point when we actually go to talk to them to ask very targeted questions, I think it's a huge opportunity, both for cancer care and to identify side effects.
Yeah, thanks. So that's a very good point, because like I believe also patients are not very well educated. They are not oncologists. They are not expert in the medical domain most of the times. So when they go to the doctor, they ask very general questions, and sometimes they miss the point, right? So that's very very interesting, and this is connected to the interaction between patients and doctors. And in this sense, I want to give a couple of numbers. So apparently, from some papers that I've read, doctors spend about 55% of their time writing notes. Then in 65% of the times are not read anymore. So they are written and they are forgotten. So this is a huge waste of knowledge and time that we actually spend. So this is like just to give an idea about how much we could save if we were using AI. And is there anyone that want to comment on this? Otherwise, we go to Michelle. Maybe Alex, any comments on EHRs? No? Okay, great. So Michelle, back to you with the question. So what can you tell us a little bit more about these investments? Where are they coming from? Who wants them? Who is doing the investments? And which are the areas that are hotter today?
Yeah. So we're finding it's interesting. Investments are coming from many different places. You have angels, which are now actually putting higher dollar figures in than they used to. The angel round used to be a small round, and they used to say, "Oh, we're doing an angel round." Now it's an angel round is 3 million or 5 million. I'm like, wait, that used to be Series A. So there's stages of investments, right? And we find that that's actually moving. A lot more private money is going into angel investments into companies. There's a lot of gender-based and diverse focus as well right now, going into companies that are founded by diverse and gender and diverse founders. And we are also finding a lot more strategic investors coming in into investments. So sometimes in areas they know, and sometimes in areas they want to build out or they see opportunities in. They might not have a direct product in a particular area, but they are engaging. And they used to tell me, that we wouldn't look at a company till it's 50 million in revenue. Now they're like, we don't care if it has revenue. We'll put in a few $100,000. And I'm looking at this, multi-billion-dollar company going, wow, you really, want to make sure that they don't fall behind the digitalization of medicine, that they're on the cutting edge, that they stay relevant, and they see deal flow. We see about 80 companies a month. So just in our vertical, right, diagnostics. So I think that these strategics are getting more and more interested in those early stages, because as the companies grow faster, in fact, that's what AI and data enablement allows for. It allows for the companies to scale faster, get the proof of concept faster, less money, and scale faster. They don't have the opportunity to come in later. So there's an interest on the part of strategics. There's an interest, of course, venture funds are getting bigger and bigger. You used to see a venture fund 100, 500 million. Now they're, in the multiple billions they're raising. And then you also see what's interesting. Some of the traditional investors in venture funds are making direct investments, whether it's pension funds or whether it's endowments or whether it's, institutional money, which I think is fascinating. They're looking for rights to invest alongside the venture fund after they're in. So there's a lot of different sources of capital that weren't there before. As to what they're looking at and the areas that are exciting, I think certainly the genomics and epigenomics and long read sequencing areas are very interesting moving forward. Continuous monitoring as a class of focus is very interesting. I think the original low-hanging fruit was all the imaging modalities for AI and data. But there are some really interesting ones, like, we have an eye scan for early detection of Alzheimer's, so multispectral imaging. So taking, basically what you're doing is you're digitizing data in your body, right? And then you're analyzing it to figure out what patterns or what confluence events are creating, this correlation, sometimes causal, sometimes not, to the actual situation. So we're seeing things like, saliva, a lot of saliva. We're doing a lot of non-invasive methodologies for identifying things that are going on with your body. Urine, for kidney health, saliva and breast cancer, tech platforms for, using basically behavioral patterns, circadian rhythms, all sorts of things for mental health, as you mentioned, voice earlier. Targeted digital therapeutics, right? So you get a bottle with directions instead of a pill. Which is quite interesting. Breath prints we're seeing, skin imaging, voice, as I mentioned, cognitive functions, eye tracking, wearables for everything, monitoring or proactively diagnosing. What's really exciting about that is I think that, my biggest focus is trying to get these things, you talk about the healthcare system, earlier, right? And less invasive, because it's more access to the population, for healthcare. And it's the better chance of recovery and less costs for the system. So both from a human perspective and from an economic perspective, I think the exciting areas are focusing on the early, the disposition to a particular illness and the early diagnostic of them together are both important. One drives the next, right? The investigation of the next. And yeah, those outlying areas of, like I said, sequencing in the long read as opposed to, the small snippets and things like that, I think that are AI and data enabled are driving a lot of where the money's going.
I see. Very, very interesting and very explicative. So, one thing where you went back was the multidimensionality of data and the dataification of the reality, right? We turn everything into numbers and we use these numbers as features to try to make prediction, find correlations or causation relations. So that's another piece. So how do you see this from the pharmaceutical perspective? So maybe we start with Stefano. What kind of data do you use? What kind of multidimensional data do you use for drug discovery?
Very, very, very big and complex question. Everything, every kind of data. So it's difficult to say what we are not trying to use. If you don't use some data, it's because we are not capable to manage this data, but we would like to. And just about multidimensionality, but I would like to make just a comment that is for us is very important in our lab, in our company, is that one of the dimensions that is usually neglected, unfortunately, is time. So most of the work is done assuming that the things are stationary.
Stefano, can you speak a little bit closer to the microphone?
Sorry. I say that most of the people in the research assume that the concentration of biomarkers of particular compounds is constant in time. And so that means that if I check a difference between a value, a concentration of a compound in different moments, so something happens. But the network of the connection of all receptors and genes is very, very complex. And in all these networks that are feedback regulated, the concentration do not remain constant. So there's some fluctuation. And these are what most people consider a noise, but this is very, very difficult to analyze. And this is also the main problem in personalized medicine, because it's difficult to find out if a difference that you are measuring, it depends on the particular state, a particular phase, or is really something relevant. So just about the data, our challenge now is just to add this time, this extra dimension that permits us, for example, to understand better what is a target. And a target is not a simple receptor or a single gene, but is a portion of the network.
Oh, okay. Okay, thanks. That's very interesting. Arsha, you work with text mostly, right? So What kind of information can you extract from text, and what kind of text do you look at?
So just to provide a general perspective of the whole text mining, natural language processing, right? So usually in most of the presentations I do, the first slide I always have is like the text is everywhere, right? So I don't think we have an escape from text, right? And it's never going to happen. So it all depends on the availability of the data, high quality data, and also a very strong use case, which can drive the need for a text mining. So if I can just highlight a couple of examples where we have applied text mining very successfully, are in the areas of regulatory, we have medical information, as well as in the manufacturing, post-market. I can give you probably hundreds of examples. But one of the flagship projects that we did in 2019, so it went live in 2019, we have also published 2 articles as well, and we are also kind of one of the quite early adopters of text mining in the spaces in the area of regulatory information processing. So there is so-called as IDMP, you might have heard of it. It's a new legislation. It's rolled out by EMA, European Medicines Agencies. And basically all the pharma companies in Europe are supposed to prepare the data in the pharmaceutical data in a predefined formats, and that has to be submitted back to the authorities. And the challenge that we face here is most of the product information that we have in a company, or most of the companies, are in unstructured formats in different ways and kind of present in different locations and so on. And that is where we have been applying text mining to ensure that we are able to systematically structure all the information present in this product, let's say dossiers, so that we are able to now prepare the data and kind of be ready for this IDMP submissions going forward. Just as one example. A couple of other examples I can also highlight is in terms of the medical information. So whenever we as a healthcare pharma company, we get a lot of inquiries from our customers and patients. And it's also very important that we're able to identify the trends in this data, understand what are the kind of points of concerns that are raised by the patients. Are there any kind of adverse events that has been reported by the patients? If I now speak about the manufacturing as an example, just to give you a kind of a flavor, completely different flavor, right? So here we speak about the manufacturing problems. If I look into our manufacturing sites, so whenever there is a problem, somebody is going to let's say local quality management systems, and they describe the problem, the manufacturing deviation, and there is basically a corrective and preventive action, any kind of investigations which are triggered, which is again completely text data which is recorded, right? So here we are applying text mining to understand what are the more recurrent manufacturing problems, so that we are able to help our quality managers on site to kind of define better root cause investigations and corrective and preventive actions, so that we can kind of avoid or mitigate the occurrence of deviations going forward in the future. So I think the whole text mining is kind of quite generally and very easily applicable across different types of data, I would say, within the organization.
Thanks a lot. Yes, before you were mentioning unstructured and structured data, just for the listeners, unstructured data is like free text, basically, which computers are unable to understand. But structured data is tables, like they can be like Excel tables or other tables or graphs, maybe where the various nodes are connected through edges, and so the computer can kind of elaborate them better. Alex, on your side, you work also on multi-dimensional data, and in your experience, what are the customers asking you the most? Is it the textual data or so on? And what is the hardest to somehow annotate and control?
Very interesting question, Enrico. Thank you. So the clients come to us to help them structure the data that they have. It could be text or speech or images and videos. And in some other cases, they also come to us to gather more data in order for them to balance their data sets. So let me start with the data gathering and balancing the data sets as something we haven't touched yet. One big problem that we see in machine learning and AI is bias. And that bias often comes from the data itself. For example, if the data from a clinical trial or data that you have collected or maybe crowdsourced in some occasions represent more a specific demographic group, right, a gender or socioeconomic class, an age group, and so on, then you're going to develop biased models. In some cases, you may want to have some bias, right? But in many cases, you don't want that. It can be damaging for your algorithm or in the end for the patients. And we have many examples in history where a medicine, for example, could not be approved for women because the trial group didn't have enough women participants or any at all. So our role in that data pipeline is to identify what are the gaps in the data sets and collect them. But since you asked about challenges, let's assume that we're trying to collect voice data, okay, voice recordings, to develop a speech recognition model or something that can identify problems in patients or diagnose something through voice biometrics. This is a difficult task because, you know, developing a consumer product is much easier. You can crowdsource this data. Okay, you can collect it from 1 million users, and then you can do some quality checks and deliver a good data set, good balanced data set. But now, if you need to find patients that represent only 1 in a million inside your population, all of a sudden, our community that may have 1 or 2 million members is insufficient, right? So we need to go and curate this data from specific sub-communities and be very creative in how we are going to gather it. So this is one of the challenges that we're dealing with. Now, in terms of your other question, what kind of data are our clients requesting? I would say that we see quite a balance between voice data, between visual data, and text as well. So we're working on all these 3 data types. And in some cases, we need to collect it. And in many other cases, we need to do what you mentioned before. We need to label it or convert it from an unstructured format to a structured format with the help of humans in the loop. So we have people that are actually looking at the data, adding the right labels. We provide them with some tools to make sure they do that consistently and they do that fast in order for us to control the cost of that whole endeavor. And we have also some processes in place to measure the agreement between the labels provided by different annotators. So I hope that covers your question.
Yes, you absolutely answered the question, and that's very interesting. So is time also a challenge for you? I mean, when you collect, for example, voice, right, or when you are annotating videos, I suppose there's time in the middle. So it's also a challenge on the annotation side.
There are 3 very important variables here: time, budget, and quality of the data. Okay, and we have to operate in these constraints. And unfortunately, until now, many companies or even research groups have estimated the importance of getting high quality data, and they kick off a project and they don't take into account the labeling. They say, okay, that's not a problem, I can do that, or I can have a few of my data scientists. And in the end, you end up having your data scientists and your engineers, very valuable resources, or your other employees, labeling data instead of doing what they are doing best.
Right, thanks. So before I recall, probably Arsha mentioned the word regulatory bodies. And that's a topic that is super hot now, because the European Union is proposing a framework for regulating AI. So this goes pretty much in a different direction from what the US and Asia are doing, right? The US says, like, guys, go run, build whatever you can, and we will see later what we have to do. Asia even worse, like literally, and they are actually exploiting AI also for kind of social and civil reorganization of the society with these rewards and these things that are a little bit scary in a certain sense. So my question is for all of you, you can take the order you want. It's like, what do you think about this? Do you think the regulatory framework may help AI or may suffocate this AI revolution? And in which ways, if you can tell me your feelings and opinions? Maybe we start with Michelle, like higher level.
Absolutely, sure. Absolutely. So yeah, so I think what we can take a page in is if you look at the US and you look at COVID and you look at the regulatory structure and the process that was accelerated, whether it's Operation Warp Speed or any of these, where there's a lot more pressure on regulatory bodies to come up with solutions faster, right? Because the regulatory approvals takes, like you were says, that 2.7, I think it is billion and 9 to 12 years for a drug to get to market, right? So so it's a good page to take when you're looking at regulating AI, because you want to strike that right balance between not inhibiting innovation, but still critically important regulating AI, for good purposes, for protect classes of citizens, elderly or children, from certain things. And so I think it's necessary, the regulation is necessary, but the way in which you regulate it has to be very thoughtful and has to run that fine line between not inhibiting innovation. I think it can be done. I think you have some basic tenets, that you need to follow, specifically, how you're operating, what your purpose is. Is it a good purpose? Are you trying to accomplish something really important for humanity here? What is your approach to bias? Because that's really critical. My colleague mentioned that, and I think they for years they did, in science at least, in medicine, experiments on male rats, or mice, I should say, not rats, but those things matter in the results, and so really reflecting the outcome for the people that need it most. They should take into account those kinds of issues to come up with and then also you have to obviously take into account economic factors. We in the US have a legislation that they're looking at trying to pass, which is preventing large companies from acquiring some companies, and everybody's up in arms in that, because that's why a lot of the innovation happens. That's why money goes into it, because there's going to be an exit, and there's only a small amount of players that can give you that level of exit. So if you chill that, it's going to impact dramatically the innovation. So every little piece, every little act has a reaction, right? And so you have to be very thoughtful in the way you do that. But I think it's necessary. We have to regulate for so many social and economic reasons.
Thanks, Michelle. Who wants to go next?
Just to complement Michelle, I think it's all about the risk-based approach, right, end of the day. So how we try to differentiate between how much regulatory norms to apply and how much not. It's all based on the risk assessment that we typically do. And what often happens is, like, I haven't seen many use cases where we take the results of AI, which is then used for directly, let's say, kind of submitting the information to the authorities. The decisions are not, let's say, being done by machines, luckily, right? Maybe in some years that may happen, but at least not now. So we always argue and say that AI is just augmenting the effort of experts, right? End of the day, it's always an expert who is taking the decision. And the AI is rather used to kind of more enable him, expedite the whole process, ensure that there are less false positives or kind of less false negatives in your observations. So in this way, we are able to at least kind of ensure that we are able to kind of make a right balance between how much of regulation has to be applied against how much of still freewheeling AI can still be applied. I think that is the one way of perspective of I can look at the situation.
Thanks, Harsha.
I find it interesting to think that in the future, maybe people will have more access to their own data and ownership of their own data. That's partially happening in healthcare in the US. There was a federal law passed in the fall where patients should have access, timely access to their opportunity there in helping patients actually model their own data in the future in a way that kind of can empower the true owner of the healthcare data, which is the patient. So that's something that I think is interesting and happening in the US.
Thanks, Charlotta. Alex, Stefano, anything to add?
I can tell you a very short story, a real story. But when the pandemic hit Italy, I and with my company, we start to work with an app for contact tracing analysis. So we did our best to provide, to offer all the warranties about the data, how we manage the data, and so forth. And the discussion was incredible because in the end, it was a lot of the discussion was totally politics. So we demonstrated statistically that actually the contact tracing using Bluetooth low energy could be helpful. Could have been, it could have saved many lives. But we are in trouble in a discussion, an incredible discussion about the regulatory and political discussions. So, for example, my position was, okay, now we, as a scientist, we want to offer an evaluation about the efficacy. And then maybe, and of course, we have to discuss about the limits of the use of this data, because behavioral data that are very, very, very critical data. But in Europe, I can tell, because I discussed with many guys, many colleagues across all Europe, in particular in UK, in France, and Switzerland. But the discussion never evolved in the direction of how to use the data, how we can do with this data, and how to protect the data, and how to as a sort of negotiating, because I want to give up my personal data, the minimum amount possible of my data, just to have an advantage. In the same way, when you go to the hospital and then you offer your clinical data to a clinician, to a doctor, just because you want an advantage. And so my perspective, my feeling was that in Europe we have been engulfed with a very sophisticated discussion that could.
Yes, they were mostly managed by the media in a certain sense. I know this situation pretty well because I was your competitor in the tracing apps. I was working at the tracing app of MIT, Safe Paths, at the time, and we were talking with the Italian ministry, and it was so complex to somehow get over that. So great, thanks Stefano for this story. Alex, anything you want to add? Otherwise, we move to the next question.
Yeah, sure. So, there's no doubt that there will be new regulations and things are happening. I don't know what direction they will take. Obviously, there will be more transparency for the patients, as Charlotta said, and that's great. But we really need to proceed fast with those regulations, no matter what direction they will take, because this state of uncertainty is harming the economy, is harming companies, harming startups. I've been involved in a few startups as an advisor in the past 12 months, and I've seen that people really get paralyzed by those conversations, as in the same context as Stefano mentioned before, right? They can't really proceed. They spend a lot of their time discussing about how can we use data? Are we even allowed to use it, right? And I also see it in my own business as well, right? It takes a very long time until we figure out how we exchange data with the clients, do different audits, and make sure these audits are compliant with all possible regulations in all different possible regions.
Mm-hmm. So are these comments referred to the European situation or worldwide?
I believe this is worldwide. I'm experiencing that worldwide, and there are also differences between different regions, right? You see the data regulations in China so different from Europe and so different from the US. And if you add to those differences the overall uncertainty, the problem is slowing down the economy quite a lot.
Sounds good. Okay, so we have the last 10-15 minutes. So maybe now we try to make the pace a little bit faster. And I'd like to talk, if there was one limitation to address, which limitation in the AI domain would you address? I start with Arsha. Like interpretability or bias or fairness, whatever. If you could
you just repeat the question? Sorry, you said about what limitations?
Yeah, which limitations there are in AI? If you could only address one limitation, which one would you address?
So I would say that since I come from a very specific domain, right, I see the generalizability is one of the biggest challenges that I typically see. That is, in AI, you typically work with a very specific type of data, right? You kind of train models, you do evaluations, and you're sure that it's going to work. And the biggest challenge I typically see is like, how are you easily able to kind of take a specific kind of model that has been developed for a specific data and apply on a completely different unseen type of data? Although people have been speaking about concepts of active learning, the transfer learning, and so on, also the success rate is also not very, very high, right? So we often see, for example, cross data set evaluations, right? This means a model has been trained on a specific data set, labeled by a specific set of annotators, and it's now kind of applied to a completely different data set, right? Labeled by different annotators. You see that the performance is kind of significantly dropping from 90% to 70%. We have several such kind of cross corpus, cross data set evaluations. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges and limitations that I see, that it's often kind of very data specific and task specific. You may be still able to kind of do some transfer learning with minimum efforts, but I don't think we are still at that situation that you can easily kind of generalize the models very easily across multiple domains. That is
Great.
what.
Thanks. That's a very data scientist answer.
Yeah.
Charlotta, let's see whether we will somehow mirror the profiles.
I totally agree, actually. Generalization is a huge issue in healthcare. I mean, even like it's okay if you have to train data or retrain data when you access a new data set, but in healthcare, it's very, very hard because I can't just access data from a different healthcare system. So that is really a challenge. And thinking about ways how we can access data from multiple sources and perhaps train them without anyone actually accessing the data or the PHI. I think that would be interesting.
So
federated learning. I think that's maybe an opportunity there.
Generalization to the other zero for the moment, Michelle.
Yes. So I'm a lawyer by background, by training. So for me, privacy is really probably one of the main issues, because it's balancing the interests of science with the privacy of the individual data, and trying to navigate that very delicate path. I think is the biggest challenge I see.
Thank you, Stefano.
Enrico, you asked just one limitation. So if I have to choose one limitation, then I totally agree with Arsha and Charlotta. This is a generalization is the, so yeah,
Alex,
I have to choose.
I think I would also add interpretability to the mix. Just to, it would also reduce the fear factor a little bit about AI. There's a lot of people with a huge followers base out there saying that AI is a potential threat, and it could be. So if we're able to understand a little bit how AI works a little bit better than we do nowadays, I think it would reduce a little bit of that fear factor and will help us move forward more uninhibited.
Great, thanks, Alex. Great. So next question: how did the COVID pandemic change the situation for AI? Whoever wants to start.
I'll start.
Okay. Okay.
I think what was wonderful about it was, first of all, people on the science side, people started to understand the importance of early diagnostics and understand RNA and understand how AI and data is able to parse through those millions of data points to get something that's relevant to them, that's really critical right now in their world, that's stopping them from working, that's stopping them from traveling, that's causing them economic hardship. It's like, it's not a problem until it becomes your problem, right? So so the fact that this problem, this COVID, really forced people to understand and look for solutions and realize how important AI and data is to creating those solutions, I think was probably the best thing that I saw that came out of this whole pandemic.
Do you see, sorry, a follow-up question to you. Did you see a change in the investment side, like whole investment went towards RNA or, I don't know, some other kind of technologies?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I saw a continuous influx of COVID diagnostics, right? Constant. And as a venture investor, we look at the 5-10 year horizon, even more. So it's interesting because my first question was, okay, this is great. Tell me how this technology that you're doing and this, what you've said, applies to other kinds, whether it's other viruses, whether it's is it a platform technology? Is it just for addressing one item? I mean, I saw entire funds, one of my friends running an entire fund that was just on pandemic and COVID focused technology. So I think the definitely RNA, definitely genetics, and definitely people who are really recognizing the AI and data enablement, which is the key for what we invest in terms of AI and data enabled diagnostics. That's been something that I no longer have to convince somebody of, which is delightful for me, because it really is the key to the entire healthcare system. It gets about 5-7% of the funding, but it guides 60-70% of the whole patient journey, whether it's COVID or anything else. But COVID has brought a new awareness of it in a way that's impacted people, so they actually learned and cared enough.
Thanks a lot. I want to keep Charlotta later, so maybe we get to Pharma, Stefano, and Stefano from the university and Arsha from the industry. Did you see a big change?
Well, from a COVID perspective, right? So again, if I have to step myself in the shoes of a data scientist, I mean, just as an example, right? What you could really see is that a lot of data sets were suddenly released, and there was a lot of kind of hype around Kaggle competitions, for example, the text retrieval challenge, who kind of started to release some corpuses and so on, right? So you could see like there was a sudden kind of spike and a lot of concentration of data science kind of work, trying to kind of understand potential, let's say, kind of risk factors of COVID, for instance, right? How can we kind of contribute to the whole community of COVID, for instance, right? More from a data science point of view. I think that kind of experimented, let's say, the whole data science work, benchmarking of data sets, benchmarking of algorithms. I think suddenly, I would say, right, which never happened really at that drastic fashion in the past. And second one is more the organizational factor is like, since the people who work in the area of AI, data science, and so on, right? And what we really learned out of this whole pandemic is like, how can we really operate more online, for instance, right? So we never did any kind of design discussions and design thinking kind of work in the past, never online. It always used to be kind of people really kind of coming together in the rooms and kind of trying to design on a piece of paper. I think this whole pandemic thing from AI kind of, let's say, ML perspective, more from a data science point of view, this has basically kind of changed the entire way of how we typically kind of understand the problem, how do we kind of design the solutions, which is becoming more and more digital nowadays in comparison to how we really worked in the past.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Stefano.
Yeah, about the university, I don't think that we had a very big impact in regards to the AI acceptation at the university. More in the field of startups. For example, I'm a founder of a startup that use AI, and then I could find, but I don't know if this the virus of the excitation and of ventures, because ventures are excited, and then they push toward the AI because they want AI as the magic word that can solve everything. So many times I have to cool down the big expectation, because because first is the quality of the data. There's a lot of garbage outside.
This is a very good point. Sorry, I was wondering, do you think that there may be a bubble behind AI at a certain point because the expectations are too high compared to the actually reality?
Enrico, I'm pretty sure that we are in a bubble, but not because AI is not a great and fantastic tool, but because many persons, they don't understand exactly what AI can do. So, and I'm a bit worried, maybe I'm too old, but I saw in the past many big hypes, great expectation on combinatorial chemistry, and then epigenetics and many other. And then I wouldn't like to see the same fate also for AI, because I mean there's a fantastic chance that we have, a fantastic occasion that we have now. So, but yes, there's the risk.
Okay, thanks. Then very quick on Alex, and then finally Charlotta.
Yeah, I think if we take into account that only in the USA the public debt increased during the pandemic by several trillions, I think we realize how much faster we need to be able to react in similar situations in the future. And there are not that many ways, there are not that many tools that we have to start reacting faster. And AI is a very important tool. So digitization on one hand, and AI that is obviously will obviously leverage that digitization.
So paraphrasing, if AI holds its promises, it may not be a bubble. It may actually hold its promises. Like, I mean, we have seen the vaccines, right? The vaccines are definitely a result of the adoption of AI, and they were developed in a year, which is actually they were developed in 14 days. But with the clinical trials and so on, they arrive in a year.
I don't think it's a bubble in the sense, I mean, looking at things through the industry lens, I don't think it's a bubble in the sense like, oh, AI is not going to deliver. It's just a huge hype that everybody, I think it's used a usability kind of level right now. We just see that some companies like the big tech, for example, adopted certain techniques already years ago, and we see other more traditional industries just following and using the same tool. So I have no doubt that AI is going to be used, is going to bring benefits. Now, obviously, there is a huge kind of economy that is using AI as a buzzword, right? But that's a different topic.
Thank you. And finally, Charlotta was seen probably both the academic and the tragic clinical side of
Yes, yeah. Last spring was very, very challenging as a physician, and I think many people in the AI world, they were hoping to develop mortality prediction models for COVID. But at the hospital, that's not really what we needed. We really needed more like organizational AI, like how do we efficiently schedule clinicians? Where do we schedule them to work? How do we transfer patients? Like what part of the hospital should we keep the COVID patients? Because at my hospital at Harvard, we like moved all the COVID patients over to one tower, and then there weren't enough space. You know, so like preparing for another crisis like COVID, I think it's like looking at healthcare systems, organizational, like using it like more for organizational and clinician staff preparedness, I think would be very, very valuable.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot to everyone. I have other tens of questions for you. Maybe I just let you close with one sentence each. What's going to be AI and in the healthcare? What's going to be actually the healthcare in 10 years from now? One sentence, please. Michelle?
I think patients,
Okay,
I think patients will be much more empowered and in charge of their own healthcare.
Thanks. Harsha? Let's do gender bias.
Maybe I need to think. 10 years. So if somebody is ready, I mean, you can go with it. You don't have to wait for me. Then probably I can take the next round then.
Okay, so Alex?
I don't want to make any predictions. I'll just close this with my favorite motto: with great data comes great responsibility.
Okay.
Yes.
That's also true.
Take that into account, and in 10 years from now, we'll be in a better place. That's all I can say.
Stefan?
I think that in 10 years it's very difficult to make any forecast. I mean, the things are changing so fast. And then, as Charlotta said, everything will be more focused on the single person. we will be enabled to, in condition to analyze our own data, or we can ask somebody to analyze our own data, and there will be so many data that it's difficult to imagine the potentiality, so the things that can happen. So, sorry,
Thanks.
not a single.
And Michelle.
Yes. So I can say, I think the future for me is in AI and healthcare as a doctor is going to call me to come in because my watch or clothes or my iPhone alerted, my doctor about a condition. My dream, to be honest, is that everybody can go to a doctor and come out knowing exactly what's wrong with them and what to do about it. And this sort of really focus on non-invasive, less expensive, more accurate, really access to healthcare for all, because at the end of the day, healthcare, shouldn't be an economic privilege. It should be a human right. And we have to figure out ways with AI and data to make that happen.
Thanks a lot. So, Arsha?
Enrico,
I think we have been hearing about this personalized medicine, right? So I hope that in 10 years, I'm not sure if this will really be there, but probably let's say the situation will be probably more closer to having more personalized medicines and kind of more precision medicine, what people have been speaking about, right? And I hope that we'll be kind of getting more and more closer to the situation probably in 10 years from now. I think that is my personal wish where we can be.
Great. So thanks everyone for participating to this panel. We went a little bit over time, but it worth the effort, and thanks a lot to the audience, and we look forward for the next panel.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Enrico.